In the second half of the social divisions topic, we're going to look at the sort of third major division in Roman society. So the key questions to take notes on are, what were the rights and responsibilities of the Patricians, the Equestrians, and the Plebeians? So the division between Patrician and Plebeian is a really important one to get your head around, and we'll see it pop up again and again in the politics topic. So if you're not quite sure about this first time round, make sure you come back to this video later on if you need to. So we'll just start off by looking at the sort of structure of Roman society in a diagram form. So at the very bottom of the pyramid, we've got freedmen and slaves. So they're at the bottom because they're the least important, they have the least amount of influence, but also if we look at it in terms of area, there's also more of them than any other group. On top of this, we have the common people, or the plebeians. Further up, we have the equestrian class, or the knights. And finally, at the very top, we have the senatorial class, or the patricians. So they're the most important, but there aren't very many of them in comparison to the other groups in Roman society. So we'll start from the top of the pyramid looking at the patricians, who are the sort of senators and their families. So technically they were descended from the 100 advisors of Romulus, who was the first king of Rome. So the class was political in basis, although the division becomes less kind of black and white the further we go in Roman history. And they're called patricians, coming from the Latin word pater. You'll remember that means father, because they acted as elders or fathers of the state. In order to become a member of the senatorial class, you needed to have 1 million sesterces in money or property. And once you made it into this class, you were able to hold the highest political offices and you had the most amount of political influence. So they obviously had restrictions and privileges, each class, so we'll just start off by looking at the patricians. So they were able to earn money and gain money by owning land. However, they weren't able to engage in business activities, so they needed to rent out property. But of course, some of them would use agents or sort of middlemen in order to get around this, this prohibition. And as a mark of their status, you might remember from the clothing topic, they wore a toga with a wide purple stripe, and they also had maroon leather shoes and a gold ring, so they stood out. The next class down is the equestrian class, also known as the knights, and they are known as the equites in Latin, so you can sort of use any of these three terms for them. And their name comes from the Latin word equus, which means horse, because originally they had to be rich enough to own a horse, and they formed the cavalry in the Roman army. They needed 400,000 sesterces to qualify, as opposed to 1 million, and they sort of emerged as a class to take on the roles which the patricians weren't allowed to have, so running businesses, collecting taxes, and so on. Because they did these sorts of activities, many of them did earn enough money to become patricians, but they didn't always want to do so because then they would have to give up those commercial activities. Later in Roman society, many of them gained really high offices in the government and worked as civil servants. So as a result of all of these factors, they often became really, really rich and could become richer than the patricians, but they were always looked down upon because they were new money. And the third major group is the plebeians, also known as the plebs. So they formed the great mass of Roman society. They took up a large amount of space in that pyramid, but they didn't really have much power. They were able to earn a living through being employed by an equestrian or a patrician, or through running their own small business, like they might have owned an inn, for example. But most of them were extremely poor, and quite often they were worse off than slaves because they didn't have someone looking out for them. They didn't have much say in voting. Individually, they had very little influence. They were represented by a tribune, and we'll learn more about this as we go through this chapter. So, yeah, they didn't really have much influence on their own, but if you look back to the pyramid diagram, they could be a very big force as a group because there were so many of them. And the plebeians ended up forming this group, this really important group at Rome known as the urban poor. And the Latin term for this is the protelarii. So these are people who are living in the city and they don't have any land. So the numbers of these increased over time. One important factor was when the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded and occupied Italy from Africa and destroyed a lot of farms, so a lot of people lost all their livelihood and had to come to Rome. In addition, the provinces were able to provide the food which the small farmers outside of Rome had once done, and the wealthy elite ended up buying great estates, so these people couldn't find jobs. And added to this, we've got the problem that there were so many slaves that Rome had captured in war. So there were a lot of poor, unemployed people in the city of Rome, and it became increasingly important to keep this group satisfied to preserve political stability in the city. We'll just finish up by looking at sort of how you could move between classes. So as you can imagine, there was a really big gap between rich and poor, so you couldn't really move between classes very much. The only real way that you could do this was to acquire a whole lot of money. It was possible to do this, and some people did move classes, but they were always faced with the stigma of being a novus homo, or a new man. So the first in your family to reach a particular position, you didn't have that great history behind you, and Romans loved precedent. And loved having distinguished ancestors. So if you made it to the top from the bottom, you were very special indeed. So just check that you've got notes on the rights and responsibilities of the Patricians, Equestrians, and the Plebeians, and we'll discuss these important divisions further in class.